It's easy to get caught up in headlines about budget cuts and funding freezes, but it's easy to forget about the actual people, on the other end of those decisions.
True.
Today, we're going to be looking at how President Trump's executive order to halt USAID funding is hitting Adventist humanitarian work.
Yeah.
And we've got some excerpts from a Spectrum magazine article called Food Will Rot, People Will Die.
Oh, wow.
That's going to kind of guide our deep dive today.
Okay.
And get this, the article claims that Trump's USAID chaos is actually harming Adventist missions. So this is going to be a fascinating discussion.
It is. It's a powerful reminder that even in a globalized world, what seems like a distant political decision can have really immediate and devastating consequences for people, thousands of miles away.
Yeah, so let's kind of break this down a little bit, okay? So on January 20, 2025, this executive order came out of nowhere, putting a 90-day pause on all USAID funding. And the administration is saying that it's to review and align aid with American interests, but there's a lot of talk about potentially shrinking USAID staff from 10,000 people down to just 300.
Yeah, I mean, the administration assured everyone that life-saving aid would continue uninterrupted.
Right.
But that's just not the reality on the ground.
Right.
Pretty much all aid work is just completely slammed on the brakes and left people in limbo.
So how does this directly impact Adventist organizations?
Well, both AGRI and AHI are heavily reliant on USAID funding to carry out their missions around the world.
Right.
To give you an idea, in 2023 alone, AGI received $62.6 million from USAID, which made up 64% of their total revenue.
Wow. Okay, so almost 2/3 of their funding was cut off overnight.
Overnight.
The article dives into the very real consequences of this freeze, focusing on the stories of ADI and HI projects in Kenya and Brazil.
Right.
So let's start with Kenya.
Okay.
The situation at Kendu Adventist Hospital in Kenya is a prime example.
Okay.
They were relying on PEPFAR funds, which are channeled through USAID, to treat over 5,200 HIV's patients.
Wow.
So just to remind me and the listeners, what is PEPFAR again?
Yeah. So PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, was started by President George W. Bush back in 2003.
Okay.
And it's actually been remarkably successful, saving millions of lives and significantly reducing mother-to-child HIV transmission.
Okay.
Through providing antiretroviral drugs, HIV testing, and care.
I see.
Think of it as like this huge global effort to combat AIDS.
Okay.
Yeah.
That rings a bell, but how does the funding freeze tie into all of this?
Well, because of the freeze, Kendu Hospital had to lay off 35 staff members.
Wow.
Their chief medical officer, Denny Hong, described it as a huge crisis.
Yeah.
And you can see why.
Yeah.
These are 35 people that are suddenly without jobs.
Right.
And the impact goes far beyond those individuals.
Of course.
These are families that depend on their income.
Right.
A community that relies on the hospital for care.
Yeah.
It's like a ripple effect throughout the local economy.
It's a great illustration of just how interconnected things are and how something that seems so distant, like a political decision in Washington, can have such immediate personal consequences for people literally halfway across the world.
Yeah, and the long-term consequences are potentially even more dire.
Oh, wow.
AI President Richard Hart fears that this disruption could lead to a resurgence of the HIV/AIDS pandemic.
Oh, no.
When patients lose access to these vital medications, their viral load increases, and the virus can spread more easily.
Okay.
And it's especially tragic because PEPFAR was already scheduled to end in 2027.
Oh, wow.
This freeze just throws everything into chaos,
Right.
making an already delicate transition even more difficult.
It's basically saying that we've made all this progress over decades.
Right.
And this decision could completely undo it all.
Yeah, and it's not just from a humanitarian perspective.
Right.
From a public health standpoint, it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, that's a good point. It really does highlight how fragile progress can be and, how quickly a global health crisis like HIV/AIDS can resurge when funding is abruptly withdrawn. So let's move on to a different situation, but one that's equally concerning.
Okay.
This time we're going to be looking at Adare, Brazil, and the plight of Venezuelan migrants. They've been doing incredible work in border towns, providing food security for thousands of migrants who have fled the political and economic turmoil in Venezuela.
Right.
And they've been doing all of this through a partnership with USAID called Project Providencia.
Yeah, so this project, formerly known as Project Alimentum, was helping around 6,000 migrants with things like food and shelter and other essential services.
Right.
But with the freeze, it's been suspended indefinitely.
Wow.
That's a loss of $1.5 million in funding.
So not only is this funding freeze impacting these long-term healthcare initiatives, but it's also pulling the rug out from under some of the world's most vulnerable populations.
Right when they need it most.
Exactly.
In this case, 28 AIDRA staff members lost their jobs,
Yeah.
and almost 6,000 migrants lost access to that essential support.
It's heartbreaking to think about these families struggling to survive in a foreign country, only to have that lifeline of support suddenly yanked away.
It's a major setback for AIDRA.
Yeah.
It impacts their credibility and their ability to operate effectively in the region.
Makes you wonder what happens to them now.
Well, David Sanchez, who directed Project Providencia, warns about the potential for increased hunger, homelessness, and disease
Of course.
among the migrant population.
So we've seen the devastating impacts of this funding freeze in two very different contexts.
Right.
But this situation kind of raises a bigger question, doesn't it?
It does.
This whole question of aid dependency.
Yeah. Critics of foreign aid often argue that it creates a cycle of dependency, making countries reliant on outside help rather than developing their own solutions.
But on the other hand, abruptly cutting off aid can cause immense harm, as we've seen in these examples. It seems like finding the right balance is incredibly difficult.
It's a complex issue. There's no easy answers.
Yeah.
Even Denny Hong, who witnessed the devastating consequences of the funding freeze in Kenya,
Right.
acknowledges the need for nations to become self-sufficient.
Yeah.
But he also emphasizes the importance of responsible and gradual transitions
Okay.
rather than these sudden and disruptive cuts.
So it's not just about cutting off aid, it's about doing it in a way that minimizes harm and allows countries to adjust
Exactly.
and develop their own capacity.
Yeah. A lot of countries like Kenya were already taking steps to increase their own healthcare funding.
Yeah.
This freeze actually undermines those efforts and could set them back significantly.
It feels like we're getting a glimpse into the unintended consequences of good intentions.
Yeah. The desire to make sure that foreign aid is used effectively and aligns with American interests is a valid one,
Right.
but the approach taken here seems to have backfired, causing more harm than good.
Okay, so we've looked at the immediate human impact of this funding freeze,
Right.
but I'm kind of curious about the broader geopolitical implications. How does this decision affect America's standing in the world?
Well, that's where the concept of soft power comes in.
Okay, now I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I understand what it means. Can you kind of break that down a little bit?
Of course. So soft power is the ability to influence others through attraction and persuasion rather than coercion or force.
Okay.
It's about building relationships, fostering goodwill, and promoting your values and ideals in a way that makes others want to cooperate with you.
So it's less about military might
Exactly.
or economic sanctions
Yeah.
and more about building trust
Right.
and these positive relationships.
Absolutely.
Okay, so foreign aid, when done well, can be a powerful tool of soft power, right?
It can.
It allows a country like the United States to demonstrate its commitment to helping those in need, regardless of political or geographical boundaries.
Exactly.
It's kind of like saying we're here to help, not because we have to, but because we believe it's the right thing to do.
Absolutely. And that can go a long way in building trust and fostering positive relationships.
But what happens when that trust is broken, like it seems to have been in this case?
Well, Austin Dice, CEO of Malamulo Adventist Hospital in Malawi, puts it really powerfully.
Okay.
He says that abruptly pulling back aid like this damages trust in the U.S. and organizations like AIDRA and AI.
Right.
It undermines years of work building relationships and creates a deep wound
Yeah.
that'll take a long time to heal.
Deep wound is such a powerful image. It really drives home the point that this isn't just about money or policies. It's about people and relationships.
Absolutely. And when that trust is eroded, it creates a void that can be filled by other actors, some of whom may not share American values or interests.
So this decision could have unintended consequences that extend far beyond just the immediate humanitarian crisis, potentially even impacting global power dynamics.
Exactly, and that's something we'll delve into further the next part of our deep dive.
This whole situation with the USAID funding freeze, it really exposes the tension between wanting to be responsible with taxpayer dollars, right?
Yeah.
And making sure we're not just abandoning people in need, especially when we've made these long-term commitments to them.
Yeah, it definitely highlights those limitations of just viewing foreign aid as purely transactional.
Right, because it's not just about the money, it's about the human impact, the ripple effects.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's about, the lives that are actually being affected by these decisions.
Yeah, and speaking of long-term impacts, the Spectrum article made a point that really stuck with me. They talked about how this abrupt withdrawal of aid has inflicted a deep wound. And it's not just on individuals or communities, but on on the very fabric of trust that had been built up over years of collaboration and partnership.
And that phrase, deep wound, that was used by AR President Richard Hart, it really paints a powerful picture. You think about the lasting damage that's being done. Damage that could take years, maybe even decades, to repair.
Imagine working for years to build trust and establish these partnerships, only to have them shattered overnight. It's a betrayal of those relationships, a blow to America's credibility as a reliable partner.
It makes you wonder if America is seen as unreliable, as a partner that can just suddenly pull the rug out from under you. Who will step in to fill that void?
That is the million-dollar question. And as we know, nature abhors a vacuum.
Right.
Other actors, some with less altruistic motives, may be all too eager to exploit the situation to advance their own agendas.
It brings us back to this whole idea of soft power. You mentioned earlier that it's about more than just winning hearts and minds. It's about strategic influence on a global scale.
Exactly. And that influence is cultivated not through force or coercion, but through consistent action, reliable partnerships, and a genuine commitment to making a positive difference in the world.
This whole conversation has been incredibly eye-opening. It makes me realize how much I just took for granted about the role of foreign aid and all the complexities involved.
It's a topic that's often oversimplified and misunderstood.
Yeah.
And this situation with the USAID funding freeze really brings to light those nuanced challenges and the potential consequences of these short-sighted decisions.
One of the things that strikes me is that this isn't just about governments and organizations.
Right.
It's about people, real people whose lives are profoundly affected by these decisions that are made, far away in Washington.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get lost in the statistics and policy debates.
Yeah.
But behind all of that, there are human stories. The healthcare workers in Kenya facing unemployment.
Right.
The Venezuelan migrants in Brazil struggling to survive without food assistance.
Right.
The patients in Malawi who are denied life-saving medications.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to think about the human cost of these political decisions. Makes you question, what kind of world are we creating? What values are we really prioritizing?
That's a question we should all be asking ourselves. Not just policymakers, world leaders, all of us. Because we all have a role to play in shaping a more just and compassionate world.
And you mentioned earlier that the Spectrum article also highlighted the situation in Malawi, where that sudden withdrawal of aid led to the closure of essential services at Malamilo Adventist Hospital. It's another devastating example of the unintended consequences of this funding freeze.
Absolutely. The article described how these aid organizations literally locked up their medication and left, leaving patients and staff in a state of shock and confusion. Austin Dice, the CEO of the hospital, he said it was a major blow to morale.
Yeah.
You can imagine the fear and uncertainty those patients must have felt.
To rely on that hospital for life-saving treatment only to find the doors closed with no explanation.
Right. It's a betrayal of trust that's incredibly difficult to rebuild. And it's not just about the immediate impact on patients' health.
Right.
It also undermines the long-term efforts to build trust and foster that sense of community. These aid projects, they often serve as a bridge between different cultures and nations, demonstrating a commitment to helping those in need regardless of political or geographical boundaries.
So by pulling back aid in such a dramatic fashion, the U.S. risks not only harming those who depend on it, but also damaging its reputation as a global leader and a humanitarian force.
It's a classic case of short-term thinking leading to long-term consequences. The desire to prioritize American interests might seem appealing in the moment, but it fails to consider the broader implications and the interconnectedness of our world.
It's like trying to save a few bucks now, but ending up with a much bigger problem down the road.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that the concept of American interests is itself open to interpretation. Does it solely refer to economic or political gain? Or does it encompass this broader understanding of global stability, security, and, humanitarian well-being?
Because if we define American interests too narrowly, we miss the bigger picture, a world ravaged by disease, poverty, instability. That's ultimately not in anyone's best interest.
The situation in Kenya with the potential resurgence of HIV/AIDS is a perfect example. The disruption of treatment not only harms individuals and families, but it also poses this threat to public health on a global scale.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a stark reminder that in today's interconnected world, what happens in one corner of the globe can have far-reaching consequences for everyone.
This brings us back to the power of soft power. By providing aid and assistance, the U.S. can build relationships, foster goodwill, promote its values and ideals in a way that military might or economic sanctions simply can't achieve.
It's about building trust, demonstrating compassion, and, recognizing our shared humanity.
And while this approach is often overlooked or dismissed as idealistic, it can be incredibly effective in advancing long-term strategic goals and creating a more stable and prosperous world for everyone.
But when that trust is broken, as it has been in this case, the consequences can be severe.
Absolutely, it creates a void that can be easily filled by other actors who may not share America's values or interests.
So this decision could have significant geopolitical ramifications down the road.
Precisely. The world is watching how the U.S. handles this situation.
Right.
And the decisions made today will have a lasting impact on America's standing in the world.
So after exploring the devastating impact of this USAID funding freeze, both on a human level and a geopolitical level, what can we learn from this situation? And what are, the potential path forward?
Well, one key takeaway is the need for a more nuanced and strategic approach to foreign aid. Instead of these abrupt cuts and, politically motivated decisions, we need a long-term vision that balances American interests with global humanitarian needs.
It sounds like we need to move beyond this simplistic idea of just cutting off aid and instead focus on creating a more sustainable system that empowers countries to develop their own solutions while still providing essential support during times of need.
Exactly. It requires a deep understanding of those complex dynamics at play,
Yeah.
a willingness to engage with diverse stakeholders, and a commitment to building partnerships based on mutual respect and understanding.
It also demands a recognition that foreign aid isn't simply charity or a handout.
It's an investment.
Yeah.
An investment in global stability, security, and prosperity. And it's an essential tool for advancing American interests in a way that benefits both the giver and the receiver.
This situation with USAID funding, it's kind of a wake-up call, isn't it?
It is.
It highlights the need for a more thoughtful and strategic approach to foreign aid. And it underscores the importance of soft power in a world facing such complex challenges that require these collaborative solutions.
Absolutely. The way forward requires a shift in perspective, a commitment to diplomacy, and a recognition that global well-being is ultimately in everyone's best interest.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We examined the immediate consequences of the funding freeze, the long-term implications for America's standing in the world, and the need for this more nuanced and strategic approach to foreign aid. So what's next? Where do we go from here? It feels like we're walking this tightrope. On one side, we need to be responsible with how we're spending aid money, making sure it's effective. But on the other side, we can't just abandon people who are depending on that aid. Especially, when we've spent years building these programs and establishing trust.
Exactly. It's the heart of the dilemma.
Yeah. Because it's not just about dollars and cents, right? It's about people's lives.
It is.
And as we've been talking about the impact of this funding freeze, it goes way beyond just the immediate crisis.
Way beyond. One of the most powerful points that the Spectrum article made was about this deep wound that this has created.
Yeah.
And it's not just on individuals or communities, but it's on the whole idea of trust in America as a reliable partner.
Richard Hart, the AI president, used that phrase.
Yes.
And it's really stuck with me.
Yeah.
You start to think about, how long that kind of damage takes to repair.
I know.
Years, maybe even decades.
It's true.
To really rebuild that trust.
Imagine it from their perspective.
Yeah.
You've worked for years to build relationships, to collaborate on projects.
Yeah.
And suddenly the other side just disappears, locks up their resources, and leaves. It's like a broken promise on a global scale.
And that broken trust, it has consequences far beyond just the immediate humanitarian crisis, right?
Absolutely.
If America's seen as unreliable, who steps in to fill that void?
It's the scary part.
Yeah.
Nature abhors a vacuum. And other actors, maybe with less noble intentions, could be waiting to exploit that.
Yeah, it makes you reconsider this whole idea of soft power.
Yes.
It's not just about being nice or popular. It's about strategic influence on a global scale.
Absolutely. That influence is built through consistent action, reliable partnerships, and a genuine commitment to doing good. Those aren't things you can just turn on and off like a faucet.
What's really hitting home for me through all this is it's not just about these abstract ideas or governments. It's about people.
It is about people. It's so easy to get lost in the statistics and the policy debates. But we have to remember that real people are having their lives turned upside down
Right.
by these decisions that are being made so far away.
We talked about, those stories about the healthcare workers in Kenya,
Right.
who are suddenly jobless.
Right.
The Venezuelan migrants in Brazil who are left without food.
Yeah,
The patients in Malawi who are denied the medication they desperately need.
it's true.
These are real people. These aren't just figures in a spreadsheet. And their stories are a powerful reminder of the human cost of these decisions.
Yeah. It really makes you question, what kind of world are we creating?
Yeah.
And what values are we really prioritizing?
That's a question each of us has to wrestle with.
We do.
Not just policymakers,
Sure.
world leaders, but all of us, right? We all have a role to play in shaping a more just and compassionate world.
Absolutely.
So we've gone deep on this USAID funding freeze.
We have.
The fallout, the implications,
Yes.
the moral questions that it raises. What's the takeaway for all of this? I mean, is there any hope for a course correction?
I believe there's always hope.
Okay.
But it requires a real shift in how we think about these things.
Yeah.
We're so interconnected globally.
Right.
We need a more collaborative
Yeah.
and compassionate approach to these challenges that we face.
It sounds like we need to move beyond, these narrow definitions of what American interests are.
Absolutely.
And really think about what it means to be a responsible global citizen.
Exactly. And we have to hold our leaders accountable.
Yeah.
Demand policies that reflect our values
Right.
and the kind of world that we want to live in.
This whole deep dive has been eye-opening.
It has.
That's for sure. A little sobering, honestly.
Yeah,
But it's also a call to action, right?
it is. It's a call to engage, to learn more, to speak up for a more humane and sustainable way of approaching this.
Yeah, because ultimately, it's not just about helping others. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
That's a goal worth striving for, a future worth fighting for.
So as you're thinking about everything that we've discussed today,
Yeah.
here's something to consider.
Okay.
What role can you play in shaping a more just and compassionate world?
The power to make a difference isn't just in the hands of governments.
Right.
It's within each and every one of us.
That's a great thought to leave us with.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another exploration of the issues that matter most. For CAE.